Hello and welcome. I'm Bianca, the CEO of Storm Skills Training, and we are really pleased to be partnering with the Derby members of the Multicentre Study of Self-harm. Today's webinar focuses on myths and misconceptions about suicide and self-harm. We invite you to actively participate for your own CPD development, and we've provided different ways of doing this. First of all, it's important that you know that we've split the session into 4 sections, and I'll take you through what those sections are in just a moment as they align directly with the learning objectives for the webinar. For each section, you've got an opportunity to answer a question. There's links provided. Might be useful to have your phone or another device handy as we use QR codes. And this provides you with an opportunity also to submit your details so we can give you a CPD certificate. We've created a PDF resource, and that's for you to follow along and also create a reflection for your own learning. So please feel free to complete that also. Today's learning objectives are all about myths and misconceptions around suicide and self-harm. In section 1, we focus on who self-harm affects, relationships between self-harm and suicide, and common precipitating life events. In section 2, we look at the prevalence of self-harm repetition, risk associated with different methods, and the prevalence of people swapping or changing methods. Section 3 focuses on risk factors, and we think about guiding support for people who self-harm. So how do we use the risk factors to guide support for people who are vulnerable to self-harm? In the final section, section 4, we look at the role of psychosocial assessment, awareness of clinical guidance, and evidence-based practitioner support. Without further ado, I invite 2 very special guests. Jenny Ness, who you've seen in a previous webinar about older people and self-harm, and of course, Keith Waters. Both work at the Derby Centre, and also Keith is one of our non-executive directors. So thank you both for being here, and I'll hand over to you.
Morning, Keith. Nice to see you. So we're going to be talking about a bit about myths and misconceptions around self-harm this morning, and this is a conversation that you and I have had a lot over the years in the context of the Multicentre study, and what feels really nice when we have this conversation is you're able to bring that experience from a clinical perspective, working in ED over many years, so bringing that research and clinical experience together.
Thanks, Jen. I think this is a great opportunity to kind of share a lot of those thoughts and ideas. I guess at the outset, though, I'm very mindful these are going to be Keith's thoughts and ideas. Hopefully they're correct, but it may not necessarily be always the correct picture. It's that that's built up over a period of time. As you say, I had worked in A&E for a considerable number of years, and therefore had many thousands of contacts, and therefore my understanding is shaped around those stories, those encounters, but also a lot of the key people around. I've really had the privilege and pleasure of meeting some of the leaders in the field of self-harm and suicide prevention, from the likes of Keith and Nav and David and Alan, Lewis, Rory and others, all who hold both high academic levels, but are really well known in the field, and they've shaped me, and it's been a real privilege to be involved. Hopefully, if I do make any clear errors, you'll correct me on them or provide the research perspective that will either support what I'm saying or, in fact, provide the different. Many people that know me as a yes, but however, because quite often I will be saying, yes, that's right, but what about this? However, it may be something different, because it isn't actually an area where there are absolute facts for everything, and it's really very clear. That makes it very rich, but it makes it very difficult as well. So hopefully that's what we'll do as we're working through this conversation together. Thank you.
So explore some of the statistics, if you like, and the key findings coming out of the research, but actually thoughts around that from a clinical perspective and what that might mean and what we feel like we do know a bit about, but actually all those questions we still don't have answers to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lovely.
Thank you.
But before we throw to Keith and Jenny, here's your first question for section 1. Self-harm is an issue predominantly experienced by young people. So if you haven't already, follow the QR code and select either true or false. Self-harm is an issue predominantly experienced by young people.
In the Multicentre Study of Self-harm, we look at all presentations coming into the emergency department related to self-harm, and we define that by any intentional act of harm to the self, irrespective of motivation. So whether somebody engaged in self-harm behaviour because they wanted to take their own life, or whether it was more kind of part of emotional regulation. We look at all of those presentations and include all of those in the study. And suicide and self-harm are very much kind of related concepts, but they are different, aren't they?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because it's very easy to see that, they're very different, because one is where somebody is harming themselves, as you say, with or without the intention of taking their life. And the other group are those that definitely want to be dying. But it isn't as straightforward as that. It's the yes, but however bit, because a number of people who may have self-harmed without suicidal intent because of what they've done or not being found after, or some other reasons, unfortunately ended up not being alive as a result of it. So they are, I guess I'd go back to the many encounters in A&E. And if I met somebody who had self-harmed and I met somebody who came in with suicidal ideation, they were not that different. There were people who were struggling as a result of vulnerabilities that they were facing. They may have one problem that felt overwhelming. They may have hundreds of problems that just felt the weight of them was too much. The concept of entrapment often comes into play, and moving, that the person felt trapped as a result of it all and wanted it to change. Some wanted it to change by doing something that was harmful to themselves, but might produce a different way of viewing the world. Others wanted it to change as a result of not being here altogether. So it's quite tricky, because there are groups that are very keen on them being separated. And we do have a national strategy for suicide prevention. We have a nice guidelines for self-harm management. But intrinsic across both of them is the need for a compassionate response, is the need to understand the person and their stories and to take them seriously, and to try to put together the whole idea of a safety plan for it. So yes, they are separate, they are different, but actually what we do and how we respond should be equally the case, no matter what it's like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels and looks a little bit different in terms of the relationship between self-harm and suicide with different kind of groups in the population. So if we will look at, from a statistical point of view, you look at the rates around self-harm and suicide in the country, those trend lines over time correlate with each other and map with each other, kind of mirror each other, really. But it doesn't necessarily, the risk around self-harm doesn't look the same in different groups. And this makes me think about the fact that self-harm is often seen as a young person's issue. but the people that we see coming into the emergency department with self-harm across the whole life cycle, it's very much not an issue that's young people in particular.
I guess I kind of think, well, why might we have that perception that self-harm is a young person's issue? Well, often it's the more mature people that are viewing at that. So it's not our problem, it's somebody else's problem in a way. But it's also that, you know, up until early adolescence, basically, self-harm is not a common presentation, but there are differences in the genders in regard to very young people. And then the graph starts to rise quite rapidly. But again, we need to be mindful that for a young person, they are starting to face life and all its problems and challenges and difficulties without necessarily a good repertoire of coping resources. They've not had life experiences as such to be dealing with. So rejections, abandonment, identity things are things that they are struggling with. So it's very easy to link the self-harm or the suicidal ideation with it being a young person's issue. We also know that it poses a risk factor for later, and maybe we'll talk later about, you know, whether this is a repetitive action or whether it's just as a one-off. But then as life goes on, the figures don't quite match as such, because self-harm and suicide can occur across the whole age spectrum. Because across the whole age spectrum, we may have different times in our lives where we are more vulnerable than others, and maybe want to struggle at coping with that, or want to find ways of dealing with it or ways out of that. But those graphs are different as well to some extent, that we have more of some groups presenting and more of others. But in terms of ages, yes, young people may be self-harming, but actually the rates of suicide are slightly less in younger people than they are in middle-aged people. And although we know that the peak is within middle-aged, it's not necessarily the same peak for self-harm. And again, in older age groups, there are differences. But we do know in the older age group that the risk for future suicide in an older person that's self-harmed far exceeds that from a younger person that's self-harmed. So it's not confusing, but it's complicated. It's complex. It's not complicated. It's complex. Does that kind of fit?
Yeah, it does, and that picture's changing all the time. You know, we talk about something called a cohort effect in population, where high rates of kind of self-harm or suicide that were appearing in perhaps a younger group then move into an older group. And is that a cohort effect, or is it actually just part of the life cycle and changing society? And thinking about what underpins self-harm behaviour, so why people might engage in that, and problems that have precipitated the self-harm and might have triggered some of that. Again, it can look different in different age groups, but what remains consistent throughout is that often they're relationship based, or kind of related to immediate challenges, so whether that's kind of legal, finance, that type of thing.
Yes, well, the studies tell us, don't they, very much that within suicide, mental illness is a very significant feature that's there, and is less so within self-harm. But again, I think that hides a multitude of fuzziness over all of that. Yes, a presence of a mental illness might lead somebody to be much more vulnerable. So when facing an abandonment, a rejection, a life issue, etc., being depressed, being anxious, etc., might mean that problem feels less manageable, less copable with, or the resources aren't there to deal with it. So I guess key for all the groups is not what the facts are in terms of the evidence, but what it means for that person in front of you. And consistently, it's about the story and what it means to that person and how it influences. Because it's very fascinating sometimes, somebody who's maybe been in a highly pressurized job situation, who's dealt with, you know, national or international type problems to be solving, can have a life problem that becomes overwhelming. So it's not easy to be able to identify who will or who won't lead to self-harm or suicide thoughts, who won't actually act on those and take it forward. So we do know overall, the final straw is usually about a relationship bit. Behind that will be lots of other things. So again, in terms of the young persons and that perception that it's a young person's thing, when we're young, we are starting to develop those sorts of relationships that are much stronger and much more meaningful. But we're new at it. Also, we're not yet fully formed in our emotional resilience to it all. So losses, abandonments and rejections are very, very powerful. I heard too often, oh, it was just a row between boyfriend and girlfriend. It's nothing serious. At that time, at that moment, for that person, it was immensely serious.
Yeah. And if you kind of look at young people, what we often see is they report challenges with relationships with kind of the family group, immediate family group, which is what you would expect, because that's the kind of closest, strongest relationship at that moment in time. And then as people move into adolescence and young adulthood, that shifts. And the most prominent problem we see is around relationship, kind of boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. And then it, again, in older adult, it kind of shifts again, and it becomes more about kind of more immediate family as well. So it's, you can see how it's people, I mean, family relationships, often they are your main support network. They are where you get your resilience from. So if you're experiencing challenges around relationships in your life, particularly those key ones, so for young people, family, for older, kind of your immediate other half, it can make you less able to cope with other things and feeling quite trapped in a situation. Yeah, definitely.
We mentioned that a lot down the track, and I guess both of you had the pleasure and privilege of working actually just down the corridor from where we sat here today with Paul Gilbert.
Yeah.
But those concepts of entrapment, those understandings about mindfulness and compassion, it certainly is one of those other bits that has shaped me and made the whole area much more understandable, but given me optimism that actually there are things that we can do that can be helpful and work forward. But often they're relatively simpler things, not necessarily highly in-depth therapeutic interventions, but that doesn't always resonate well when talking with a relative or a friend of and trying to work out ways forward. So yeah, there are differences, and it's tricky.
So the question for section 1 is, self-harm is an issue predominantly experienced by young people. Select true or false. And has your response changed at all? Let's move on to section 2, where we focus on the prevalence of self-harm repetition, risks associated with different methods of self-harm, and the prevalence of people changing methods of self-harm. So, before we begin the session, I invite you to reflect on this question. True or false? The majority of people who present to hospital with self-harm repeat attend. So, true or false? The majority of people who present to hospital with self-harm repeat attend.
It's interesting from meeting many staff in A&E that one of the perceptions is that self-harm is a significant repetitive behaviour problem, that they are seeing the same people coming in time and time again, and that number is a large number, and they find it very difficult at coping with managing, because it kind of feels, A, there's nobody helping, and B, what do we do? And are we not helping with all of this? And I'm aware that we looked at that within the Multicentre study, and actually some quite fascinating results you managed to tease out from that in some very novel ways as well.
Yeah, one of the real strengths of the study is the fact that we follow everybody up. So everybody gets a unique ID, and then we're able to follow them up over time. So things like repetition, we can look at quite clearly. And yes, there is this feeling that self-harm is fundamentally repetitive behaviour, and that if somebody's done it once, that they're very much going to engage in that behaviour again. So a number of different papers that have come out from the study have found that on average it's about 20% of individuals that come into hospital with self-harm will re-attend to that same hospital again, most likely in the next 12 months. But that is very much the minority. And then if you're thinking about those people that come in repeatedly, so more than just once in 12 months, that number's much smaller. So we did a study looking at what we termed high volume repeaters. So those people that came into the emergency department more than 15 times over a 4-year period. And we found that actually it was only 0.6 of individuals that kind of hit that threshold, so that fell into our definition of high volume repetition. But they accounted for 10% of all attendances. So it's a really small group of individuals. But the impact of that in terms of what the emergency department staff and others are seeing, it can therefore dominate a picture. So it can kind of feel like, well, everybody who self-harms is going to continue to repeat self-harm. Now, obviously, our study looks at the emergency department setting. Self-harm in the community would look quite different. We know that from some studies that have been done, but obviously it's a lot harder to study self-harm within the community. But yeah, from a hospital point of view, it's a small number that repeat to a high degree.
Interesting, isn't it? One would say, well, why are the A&E staff perceiving it to be this, or why do people perceive it as being that? And I guess in some ways it's a very challenging situation to face, to encounter somebody who is struggling to such an extent that they are wanting to hurt themselves and have then engaged in an act of self-harm is quite memorable in a way, but in a difficult way. And therefore, whenever one's seeing that, because there are a number of presentations each day in our emergency department. And so if you see the same person again, you kind of think, well, isn't everybody always repeating? And therefore it kind of builds on that memory of this being a problem and a difficulty. So the perception is not based on the reality. However, we do need to take repetition very seriously, because some do.
Yeah.
And that next self-harm act might unfortunately, in one way, be their last self-harm act, because it could result in the person actually ending their life. Or it might be their next, they never have another self-harm act, and therefore they go through life then being okay without that. So it's tricky, isn't it?
It is tricky. Often when we talk about self-harm, because of the nature of the behaviour that we're talking about, we very quickly move into talking about different types of methods that people use to self-harm. And in the context of talking about repetition, people often see self-cutting as a very repetitive behaviour, and think that when you think of self-harm, when lots of people think of self-harm, that's the method that automatically people think about. And actually, again, in an ED setting, the vast majority that people are coming in with overdose or kind of self-poisoning. It's a smaller group that come in with self-cutting. And yes, that method is associated with a slightly higher level of repetition. But actually, what we've also found in another study led by David Owens at the University of Leeds, people switch methods. So just because they've used one method at one particular moment of crisis and distress doesn't mean that it's necessarily part of that ongoing behaviour.
It's very easy to want to describe a person in terms of their behaviour and put them into a group that then kind of fits that pattern. So this person is in the terms of what they're doing. But the reality is people are fickle, aren't they? We can and we do change. And therefore, just because somebody's come in 2 or 3 times, say, with self-cutting, it doesn't mean that the next time if they do self-harm, it's going to be by that method. It could be by a different method. And actually, by changing methods could be increasing the risk as well, because it might increase the propensity to do something that may end up being more lethal or less likely to be found, or less likely to seek help as a result of it. So again, we've got to challenge that myth and misconception about self-cutting being predominantly a repeating behaviour, and that's just what the person is going to do, and therefore we always think they're going to do the same thing again. Because if we don't intervene, if we don't provide the person with the opportunity of seeing different ways of coping or getting some help with that, the risks increase. And again, we did other studies, didn't we, in the way of looking at what the risk is in terms of future repetition, but also future deaths from different methods. And, you know, when I chat with A&E colleagues, they will often feel that as self-harm is in self-cutting is often without suicidal ideation, therefore, the future risk of suicide in somebody who's self-cut is considerably less than somebody that, say, has taken a different method as a result of it. But our findings challenge that, don't they?
It did, yeah. So we've done a number of studies now which have repeatedly shown that there's a higher level of risk for future death by suicide for individuals that present with self-cutting as opposed to overdose. So that is a complete myth and misconception. And I mean, often the method in which somebody uses to self-harm is what is available to them, and what is in front of them in that moment of distress and that moment of crisis. Is not necessarily a lot of thought around that in the moment.
When we go into future stuff, means and availability is a very important factor in terms of suicide prevention within that. And again, it's a bit of a myth that people will choose a particular method. And if you make that a means not available, that they'll be safe. If in a time of distress, somebody may well switch methods, and that method could therefore lead to a more difficult situation with it all.
So again, it's about not concentrating on the behavior itself, but actually what is underpinning that and what somebody's going through in terms of distress.
Their story, what it means for them, and what their vulnerabilities are that may well help us to see ways in which moving forward. It's not about the method. It's about having that level of thinking, that level of distress, that level of vulnerability that means that they're struggling, and we need to try to address that struggling. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny and Keith. We invite you to reflect on the question that we asked before that section with Jenny and Keith. So the majority of people who present to hospital with self-harm repeat attend. Is that true or false? I'm wondering if your answer has changed. So moving on to section 3 now. And the focus of this section is the role of risk factors in guiding support for people who self-harm. The question we'd like you to reflect on is true or false. We know who will die by suicide by looking at what risk factors they have. So true or false, we know who will die by suicide by looking at what risk factors they have.
Fascinating what comes up as a result of us talking through, and quite often what helps is a key message with that. I'd just like to do a little trip down memory lane, if I may, to that. Back in 1985, when I first encountered at a more significant level the area of self-harm, hospital attendances, and to some extent the suicide bit, I was reading through the evidence and the literature that was there, and I had a kind of hope that the more that we knew, the more that we found out, the more we'd be able to help. That if, as a result of people's attendances in A&E, we're able to collect information together, categorise it, measure it, you'd be able to see who were more at risk, what that was about, and therefore make the life of the person in A&E seeing the person who's self-harmed so much more easier, because it will be able to identify who was most at risk, when they might be at risk, and what you should do about it. guess it's taken a long time to realise actually that doesn't always quite work or quite fit. However, it is useful to collect that information, which I guess is where the MCM fits in to some extent.
Yeah, and we very much still collect and look at the data in that way. So we talk a lot and look a lot at the presence or absence of different risk factors. So we know that if somebody misuses alcohol, they're, black and white, more at risk in theory. If an older adult has got physical health problems, if somebody, like we've spoken about before, if somebody presents with self-cutting as opposed to self-poisoning, there's statistically, there's a higher risk associated in terms of repetition and death by suicide in the future. But ultimately, we know we can't use that to predict ultimate outcomes. The presence or absence in that simple way of a particular risk factor doesn't tell us what's going to happen next.
I guess my change in thinking comes about from this is a Keith concept, so it may not have a very firm scientific foundation, but I call it the problem of the big numbers and the little numbers. That a lot of what we do are based on rates of population. So we talk about the population at whole. So we do have a figure that says, well, the rate in the population of 100,000 people of self-harm will be this number. Now, in essence, that number is too big anyway, but it's in reality to the big number is quite small. So who from that big number can you actually then put into the category that's going to predict them being in the small number? If we take that further, though, and make those that have self-harmed the big number, in that there will be those who will take their own life, who will die by suicide. And there are, within that group, a very small number. But actually, everyone is meaningful. Everyone is very powerful. But how do you find out that small number within it? When we talked about age groups, when we talk about other social characteristics, they come from a big number that then tells us a small number. And I hear very often, oh, this population is 3 times more likely, 5 times more likely, or within our self-harm group, having attended hospital, maybe 100 or even 200 times more likely. And that feels really significant, and it is. Well, how useful is it in identifying a person or individual that's sat in front of you? I think it makes it quite tricky. I don't know, non-scientific, I know, but how does that feel for you when I kind of dispute to some extent the foundations of a lot of the work that we're doing?
I think that's what they are, though. It's foundations, isn't it? It's pointing out areas of actually things that we need to consider and explore with an individual, but it doesn't ultimately give us the answers. And I think anyone working in research always feels like this. The more you learn, the more you realise the less you know. There's even more to learn. There's more, you just generate more research questions. So I think the study has been incredible at giving us those really solid foundations and continues to do so on important areas to look at. But when it comes to what's going to help somebody, that on its own, taken in a black and white way, it's not very clinically helpful.
And I guess that's where that big numbers, little numbers fits to some extent, because within a population, individuals within that population may possess one or more of the risk factors for future self-harm or suicide. But actually, the majority in that population who have those risk factors may never go on to act on them or be affected in that way. So it's important that we know. It helps to guide services and interventions and what people in society can do. But we need to be mindful, I suspect, that actually it's being compassionate and empowering and facilitating for those that are vulnerable. It's doing the right things for the right set of problems and difficulties there. It will in turn help to reduce self-harm and suicide, but we won't be able to identify which individual we may have saved as a result of it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jenny and Keith. And we invite you to reflect on the answer to the question that we posed before that section, which was true or false. We know who will die by suicide by looking at what risk factors they have. So have a think about that. We know who will die by suicide by looking at what risk factors they have. Is that true or false? Okay, so section 4, we're focusing on the role of psychosocial assessment, awareness of clinical guidelines, and evidence-based practitioner support. And the question that we invite you to reflect on in this is, having a psychosocial assessment can reduce someone's risk of repeat self-harm and future suicide. True or false? So having a psychosocial assessment can reduce someone's risk of repeat self-harm and future suicide. Is that true or false?
So thinking again about a yes, but however, Keith response, we've together kind of highlighted where some of the difficulties are, particularly for clinicians seeing somebody in an A&E context, by being reliant on the data side of things. However, that data is also very valuable and very important. But maybe it's reflective about the changes that have happened over a period of time. And if we look at the current NICE guidelines on self-harm and the staying safe from suicide, what they're very keen on is as understanding the person's story. We do need to know what risk factors they may have, but it's not about measuring them or making some more valuable than others, or a greater number making a greater this. It's just acknowledging this is part of the person's story, because we need to know about it, because within the population, we know there can be risk factors. It also helps to guide us in a way about, well, okay, what do you then do? Well, you need to make a formulation. You need to make some sense of that with the person collaboratively, trying to understand together what all these things mean for that person in order to move forward in a way forward, and initially to put together something of a safety plan.
Yeah.
What can be put in place by the individual and all those around them to help to keep them safe and work forward into the problem areas that they may be facing, about things that might be helpful for that. So we've kind of, I've moved there from saying how tricky the number side are to actually say how informative they are, and they still have a very relevant role, but we shouldn't be using a tool according to NICE guidelines and staying safe from suicide, as well as Royal College of Psychiatrists guidelines and others, in order to try to predict who will or won't. We must be trying to avoid the use of terminology like high, medium or low risk as well, because that confuses the issue, because somebody today might seem to be low risk, but in an hour's time, they could do something, because things can change so rapidly. Where do we go from that? How can we help people kind of that listening to this, and the staff in A&E, move forward? Because again, this yes, but however might be useful, but I think it kind of, I worry it it muddies the water with all of that.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the biggest impacts and findings of our study, the fact that just by having a psychosocial assessment following presentation of self-harm in CED drastically reduces risk of future self-harm and then risk of suicide. But something we've not looked at all in our study is, what is a good psychosocial assessment? What does that look like? So when we look at the findings, we can lay that interpretation on from kind of people's clinical experience and what makes sense from a compassionate and empathetic point of view. But actually, what does it look like when you're sat with somebody? And a colleague of ours, several colleagues of ours are down in Oxford, so Dr. Karen Sells and Professor Keith Horton have put together a guide on what a good psychosocial assessment looks like, and these are the elements of it really, and I've written them down just so I make sure I get them right, because they're very important. So it's that idea of starting with compassion and human connection, so human to human, be there with somebody in that moment of distress. focus on understanding what is happening for somebody in that moment, and what's led them to be sat with you at that time, not about predicting what's going to happen in the future, and help the person to tell their story, so their perspectives on what has happened and why it's happened, and explore the whole psychosocial context. So that's where considering the risk factors that we've spoken about before is quite helpful, because it's very much not about are they present, are they not, but actually it can guide your formulation and things you might want to consider and explore and think about. And identifying both risks and protective factors, because we often talk about the negative and the risk and worst case scenario, but actually what is present for that person that could actually help keep them safe. Avoid that checklist mentality, which I think we've spoken about quite a lot now. It's not about having a list of risk factors that are present or not, and develop a collaborative safety and care plan. So it's very much supporting that person to help keep themselves safe.
I feel like we've been on a journey today of working through. I've shared some of my long-standing history, as it were, over 50 years of involvement within mental health bit, which is shaped. But to take us to a place that I think is very useful of moving forward. There still is an important role for research and for data, etc. But there's also something very important about the compassionate response in the human to human bit. That is vital. Going back to our friend down the corridor all of those years, Paul Gilbert, you know, we are affiliatory beings. We need each other. There are very important connections that we have. And that important connection can be part of an intervention, part of trying to help somebody that's come through, that's thinking of or has done something in that sort of way. So it's been fascinating, Jenny. I think we could probably talk for hours more as well.
Which we have.
And we may do in the future. But I hope for others listening to this, some of our sharing will be useful for them. Go back to the beginning. It's not that these are definite, but it's our view of things with some of the evidence supporting it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Keith.
Well, that brings us to the end of section 4 and very close to the end of our webinar. We invite you for a final time to reflect on the question we posed before this session, which was this: true or false? Having a psychosocial assessment can reduce someone's risk of repeat self-harm and future suicide. That brings us to the end of the webinar on myths and misconceptions. I hope you've enjoyed it and learnt something. I'd like to say a very special and heartfelt thanks to Keith and Jenny for sharing their experience, expertise, time and resource with us. I want to thank each one of you for joining and watching to the end. And I'd like to remind you to make sure that you complete the survey online to receive your certificate from us. Okay. Thanks again for joining and take care. Bye.